We are living in unprecedented times, not just because of the pandemic, but also because we have seen the ugly head of racism rise in our nation. Truly, it is America's constant curse. But we have reason to hope. Young, peaceful protesters all around the world are teaching us that it is not just enough to not be a racist. This generation is teaching us that we must engage in anti-racist behaviors and practices. This series on anti-racism is designed to encourage a national dialogue on how we engage in anti-racist behaviors and practices when focusing on our teaching, our research, and our outreach to schools, communities, businesses, and industries. We will explore and discuss how we do so in a way that respects the communities we have the privilege of working with each and every day. It's prompted by the belief that Black and Brown lives matter as much as anyone else's life. Being anti-racist is fighting against racism, drawing directly from the Smithsonian Institute's website on anti-racism. Racism takes several forms and works most often with at least one other form to reinforce racist ideas, behavior, and policy. There are 4 types of racism: individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Individual racism refers to the beliefs and actions of individuals that support or perpetuates racism in conscious and unconscious ways. The US cultural narrative about racism typically focuses on individual racism and fails to recognize systemic racism. Examples of individual racism include believing in the superiority of white people or telling a racist joke. The second form of racism is interpersonal racism, which occurs between individuals. These are public expressions of racism, often involving slurs, biases, or hateful words or actions. The third form of racism is institutional racism, which occurs in an organization. These are discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices that result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color and extend considerably beyond prejudice. These institutional policies often never mention any racial group, but the intent is to create advantages. An example of institutional racism occurs in the public school system, in which most students are non-white, but are taught by mostly white teachers who are not all anti-racist. On the other hand, rich neighborhoods are more likely to have better teachers, less students and teachers of color, and more money for education. The fourth form of racism is structural racism. Structural racism is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. These systems give privileges to white people, resulting in disadvantages to people of color. An example of structural racism is stereotyping all people of color as criminals. It is not enough to say you are not racist. You need to be anti-racist. In the words of author Ibram Kendi, being anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. Being anti-racist results from a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. These choices require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon session on anti-racism.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Connie Patterson, and I am the Associate Dean, Academic Engagement in the Patton College of Education at Ohio University. I have the privilege today of being the moderator for our discussion on advocacy and allyship every day, not just when it's trending. This forum is the second of a 6-part series on anti-racism sponsored by Ohio University Patton College of Education. As we get started, I'd like to tell you that today's event is being recorded, and a recording of this session will be posted on the Patton College YouTube channel. Also, let me provide a few instructions for participation. First, we invite you to place any questions you may have for the panelists in the Q&A section. We will get to as many questions as we have time for. That said, due to the limited time we have together today, we will likely not get to all of the questions. Second, at the end of the session, an evaluation will be placed in the Q&A, and we encourage you to take a few minutes when the event concludes to provide us with any feedback you have about this experience. With all that said, let's jump into our discussion. Our panelists for today's event are Brandi Baker, co-founder of Athens Parents for Racial Equality and member of the Athens Racial Equity Coalition. Tyrone Carr, Director of Alumni Diversity Initiatives at Ohio University and member of the Athens Racial Equity Coalition. Winsome Chunnu, Director, the Multicultural Center at Ohio University. And Sarah Garlington, Assistant Professor of Social Work and member of Showing Up for Racial Justice, Southeast Ohio. Let's start by having each panelist briefly introduce the organizations they represent. Brandi, I would like to start with you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brandi, and again, a co-leader, co-founder of the Athens Parents for Racial Equality. The Athens Parents for Racial Equality is a community-based organization of parents and students that work in collaboration with the Athens City School District to address anti-racism and create and promote more inclusion in the classroom. I'm also a part and a member of the Racial Equity Coalition of Athens, which is a community collaborative that includes members of the university, the Athens City School District, the mayor of Athens, the chief of police for Athens Police Department, as well as OUPD, and also other community members. And our goal is to address anti-racism and create and promote inclusion within this community.
Next, let's go to Ty.
Good afternoon, all. After 29 years in Athens, my current home is in the Ohio University Alumni Association, where my responsibilities include, but are not limited to, creating a Latinx alumni group, reestablishing a diversity alumni board, helping to expand our LGBT alumni group, and I'm also responsible for the triannual Black Alumni Reunion, next one to be held in 2022. I too am a member of the Athens Racial Equity Coalition. Thank you.
Next, let's go to Winsome.
Hello, everyone. As Connie mentioned earlier, I am the director of the Multicultural Center, which is a part of the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, which includes the LGBT Center, the Women's Center, the Office for Multicultural Student Access and Retention, UMSAR. So what do? Our division serves and celebrates all people by helping them explore productive ways to navigate intersection of diverse identities, experiences, and perspectives.
And finally, let's go to Sarah.
Thank you, Connie. I'm here representing our local Southeast Ohio Showing Up for Racial Justice chapter. SURJ is a national organization that's part of a multiracial movement for racial justice. SURJ's role is to undermine white support for white supremacy, and we are grounded in a framework of mutual interest. white supremacy maintains systems of economic injustice, patriarchy, and other forms of repression. I'm very excited to be sharing space with folks here that I have so much respect for.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. We're going to jump right into it. The first question. The title of today's forum begins with advocacy and allyship. How would you define allyship? And Winsome, I'd like to start with you, please.
Absolutely. So this is my personal definition. There are many definitions for allyship, but this is Winsome Chunnu's definition. In its simplest construction, an ally stands up, speaks out, and supports a minority member or a social justice cause. A group of people with white privilege can use their voices, their money, their celebrity status, and so on to back up a liberatory agenda set by Black people. And I'm specifically using Black people because as a Black woman, that's my definition. And today's panel is specifically focused on race. But we want to make it clear that allyship in its broadest sense includes your ethnic background, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, or any other identity markers. Thank you.
Thanks, Winsome. Next, I'd like to go to Ty.
Thank you, Connie. My personal definition of allyship, again, like Winsome, it's mine, so they're numerous. Allyship is not a noun, it's a verb because it's something you practice. For me, being an ally means taking action to benefit someone else and not focusing on the good you're doing by helping. That is my definition of allyship.
Excellent. Brandi, how would you define allyship?
I also will personally define allyship as the conscious and uncomfortable commitment to anti-racism through introspection, support, and long-term action, as my other colleagues have stated. So that is my own personal definition of allyship. Thank you.
And Sarah, I'd like to go to you last, please.
I'll lift up what Winsome, Ty, and Brandi have said, and only add that allyship, from my perspective, is not just about intervening in problematic moments, but also being invested in reflecting on our own cultural values and organizational settings and contexts, and how we participate and reinforce white supremacist culture. So Tima Okun has an excellent resource describing the norms of white dominant culture, such as either or thinking, and power hoarding, and being an ally means changing policies and disrupting cultural norms as well.
Thank you. So with those definitions in that context in mind, I'd like to ask the panelists about what would you say has been the greatest challenge for you, either personally or professionally, as it relates to allyship? Brandi, I'd like to start with you.
I would speak to your question from personally and also professionally, having worked in DEI offices, that one of the greatest challenges of allyship is really, I think that a lot of times when it's trending and it's popular, it's easy for folks to come to the table and to want to be a part of the cause because it makes them feel good. And so allyship, in a sense, can make a person feel good and be self-serving. However, the actual cause and commitment to a social justice effort is not always comfortable. It's more than likely uncomfortable if you're truly about the change. And so those things, when folks are coming to the table and they decide to be an ally, I think the lack of awareness of what it actually means when you take on that title and when you take on that position, to really go in and lean into what what the experiences are, what the perspectives are, and also the consequences are of aligning yourself with a social justice cause. It might be the fact that you're having to step outside and there are things that you lose and gain personally, professionally, friendships, social statuses. So I do believe one of the challenges of allyship is that personal and professional accountability and looking at the things that you'll lose and gain as being an ally.
Excellent. Sarah, how about you? What would you say the greatest challenge for you is, either professionally or personally, as it relates to allyship?
Yeah, so I would really emphasize that piece that Brandi was naming about discomfort and how uncomfortable it is to take risks, make mistakes, and be learning from those mistakes. I think for me personally, the greatest challenge has been thinking and knowing what my stake in anti-racist work is. It's important to me to see how I work and reinforce values like individualism or either or thinking, and how these contribute to systems of economic injustice. Lila Watson has a great quote: "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." So I think really knowing what is my personal stake in this work as a parent, as an educator, as a social worker, and how does that inform the work that I do.
Excellent. Ty, how about you? What would you say is the greatest challenge you've had as it relates to allyship?
It's a great question. I think for me, the lines are often blurred, both personally and professionally. And I mean that when I say white people, not all white people, might notice that people of color speak about racism more frequently than they sometimes incorrectly conclude that speaking about racism comes easily and naturally for people of color. But it doesn't for everyone. While I can't speak for my colleagues, even though I know we're very much like-minded, for me as a Black man living in Athens, Ohio, learning to break the silence or speaking about racism is a coping mechanism. It's where I go into survival mode and talk about my lived experience. Lived experience as a father raising Black children and helping them to cope with allyship. I guess, Connie, that I could also say the last thing is that professionally, I often have to conform and make white people feel safe. However, at work, sometimes my colleagues experience me making them feel a little uncomfortable. And it might be in a conversation, it might be in a meeting, but it's sometimes just something I feel I need to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Ty. Winsome, how about you? What would you say would be your greatest challenge as it relates to allyship?
So my greatest challenge is getting blackballed. And I have been blackballed both personally and professionally in various instances. So I am not sure how many of you remember the Black in the Ivory hashtag. So right after George Floyd, the hashtag trended. So Shardy Davis and Joy Melody Woods are two professors who started the hashtag. And since then, just so the audience knows, that hashtag has received over 5,000 mentions on Twitter and actually inspired professors in the STEM field where they had Shut STEM Down Day hashtag, and that where they also had Strike for Black Lives hashtag as professors. And there were a lot of comments from colleagues, both in the in the professoriate as well as administrators saying we had no idea this was going on, even though we've been talking about this for years. And so when they interviewed both of them in Nature, they asked about repercussions because one of the creators of the hashtag is an assistant professor. And she said that she was pulled aside and told, girl, be careful, because people may not vote for you when you come up for tenure. But she decided as a Black woman that this was more important to her than getting tenure. So understand how critical that is, specifically for those of us in the academy who knows and understands the power of tenure. Also, since the Black Panther just passed away, Chadwick Boseman, and for me, his commencement speech to the graduates at Howard University in 2018 has remained one of those commencement addresses that has stayed with me. So he talked about when he was in a soap opera, and he said it wasn't Third Watch, and later on we found out after he passed. And he got a script and he was playing a Black male whose father had passed away, is from an urban area, and we know code for urban is from the hood. And he talked about when he went to the producer said, look, you're doing great. Everything is awesome. We love your acting. If there's anything that we can do, let us know. So then he was like, okay, you told me to ask me if there's anything I can do, so I'm going to let you know. So he went in and he met with them. And he said, is there anything that we can do to make the Black character a little bit more nuanced? So I get that his father left, and I get that his parents weren't married, but can we at least make him good at math or something so it doesn't seem as if we are portraying all Black characters in the same way? And they were like, thanks for your feedback, we'll get back with you. It turned out they never got back with him. He was let go from the show. Not only was he let go from the show, but he said his agent, when his agent was reaching out to other avenues of looking for roles for him, was told that he was difficult to work with. Keep in mind, as I often say with my students, backspace. You told him to let you know if there's anything that you can do to develop the character in a way that would make it good for him, and he did. And because he did, he was blackballed. However, later on, Michael B. Jordan, who was also in the Black Panther with him and was also in Just Mercy and has played other roles, took over his position on that show, and they did change the character to reflect what Boseman asked. So although he suffered, the people came behind him benefited. And I get it, right? Not all of us can suffer. Not all of us have the money to be able to survive if we get blackballed and we get dismissed because we want to be a part of a progressive agenda. However, the fact that he took a stand resulted in those coming after him having a role that was not stereotypical. And for me, whenever I get blackballed, whether it's professionally or personally, because I have an opinion about the way people should be treated, I always reflect on this. Since 2018, it has given me a place to retreat to when I recognize what is happening to me, as a way of saying, at the end of the day, you know what, Winsome? You are going to make this better for those coming after you. Thank you. Thanks,
Winsome. There's so much of what you just said is really actually a really great segue into some of the next questions as I'm thinking about the idea of power and speaking up and maybe you yourself not realizing the positive outcome, but people coming in behind you, but how frustrating it is. And also, I mean, earlier today, Ty, you had mentioned, the allyship being a verb, right? This is something that we do. This is something that, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And in positions when in the academy or other organizations where there is power and a power differential, what are you willing to sacrifice or risk in order to be an ally? Brandi, would you like to respond to something that Winsome said?
Actually, I did want to add something to what she said. I think, first of all, I commend you for speaking on that and for saying that, Winsome, about it's consequences not just for allies who are white, but it's also consequences for minorities who are trying to be self-advocates in a space to promote anti-racism. And I think adding on to what Winsome said and addressing what one of the challenges of allyship is looking at performative allyship, performative wokeness, people who come to the table and it's convenient for them, it's opportunistic a little bit for them to be at the table. I'm sure for those producers in that case and in that scenario, it was advantageous for them to start with someone new to own that space of what was being said. And that's also considered like this saviorism, white saviorism when it comes to allyship, people who are coming to the table and they're taking ownership of maybe ideas or initiatives that are going forward at the expense or consequence of another person of color. And so I do want to I wanted to add on to that, as that is a challenge and can be a barrier and even a conflict of interest when partnering with allies, is understanding who's holding space for great intentions and really trying to drive things forward, and who's also coming in maybe with intentions that are not in the best interest or best serving of those minoritized groups who are experiencing oppression.
Thanks, Brandi. Thanks for adding into that. So, and there's holding the space, I think is and taking the time, and who is it and why are they speaking, and are they speaking for themselves, or are they speaking on behalf of other people who might be experiencing something different from them? Earlier, Ty, you had made mention that sometimes you felt like you had to make white people feel safe when we were talking about conversations, or thinking that speaking about racism is easy for people of color. I'd like to ask you to follow up with that a little bit with you. What do you feel you have to do to make white people feel safe?
Well, Connie, I think I don't want to say fortunate, but I've been often told from people that I've interacted with, even people who I've met for the first time, they say things like, oh, Ty comes across as safe and non-judgmental. And so for me, that means that I can have an honest conversation with people. And I don't have a problem doing that at all. I mean, God knows I'm not perfect, but it allows me the space, the safe space to say X, Y, Z, or, just whatever it is that we're thinking and talking about. And again, it just kind of comes naturally for me. I don't know how to explain it, but something else. And this is a line from Hamilton. Ty's the kind of guy you'd like to have a beer with.
And that's a wonderful show. Winsome, how about you?
Oh, thank you, Connie. So I have an article that is coming out in the October issue of Insight into Diversity. And that is the magazine that gives the HEAT Award to educational institutions for their work in diversity. And it is titled Diversity and Inclusion Training Must Be a Part of the Revolution, because one of the hashtags that came out of George Floyd was and still is that diversity and inclusion training will not be a part of the revolution. And as someone in higher ed and someone who does these trainings, I strongly believe that our trainings must and should continue to be a part of the revolution. So part of that is not in that article, but another piece that I am working on called Thug Allyship. I talk about making white people feel comfortable, but it's specifically within the framework of diversity training. And I made a list so that people know. So one of the things and this is after over 12 years of doing this, is you have to use the simplest language, because you do not want to make the white people there uncomfortable. If you ask them to do the reading, for example, one of the things I talk about is if, for example, a department, a college, etc., is having the orientation day, for example, where it's a whole day of a retreat. And throughout the day, we're doing budgeting, strategic planning, and everything else. And we squeeze in an hour for diversity. Oftentimes, what I've seen in my 12 years, people come in and they're like, oh, Winsome, we didn't get to read the diversity stuff because I was so bogged down with budget and reading about strategic planning. And so what you then do is like, oh, it's okay, no worries. But of course, you're wondering, I am wondering, you didn't take this seriously? So you think budgeting and strategic planning are more serious than diversity? But then as soon as something happened with George Floyd, now we need to know what to do. Well, I gave you the readings and you didn't do it, but because I don't want to piss them off, I go to, it's okay, don't worry. Then the other thing we often hear is you cannot preach to people with a PhD because they're seen as experts in their field. So when I go into these trainings to make them feel comfortable, I have to acknowledge that, because clearly I have a PhD, but you are saying you're an expert in your field, so you must think that I cannot preach to you because diversity is not a field that is to be taken seriously. Mm-hmm. And so appeasing those are 4 things. There are more, but I want to move on because I know that we have a large panel and I want to make sure we get everybody in. But those are some of the ways that I am highlighting in this paper about what I have done to make white people feel comfortable during diversity trainings.
Thank you, Winsome and Ty. Those are really great examples. I think so much of it is a prioritization of values. And the example that you gave, Winsome, about making time in a busy agenda, and the budget and the strategic plan and those other things take up the time, that is implicitly or maybe explicitly vocalizing and articulating values. right? I mean, and so, you know, in terms of today and how to be an ally every day, right? Not just when it's trending, right? Not just when people are saying, you know, how can I be better? How can I help? It is every day, and it's making that priority every day. So thank you so much. So I want to move on to another question, and so sometimes an effective method for identifying and helping others recognize microaggressions are by calling people in, as opposed to calling people out. Can you share with us one or two strategies you've used to call people in? Ty, I'd like to start with you.
Oh, thank you for the question, Connie. And going back to, you know, Ty's the kind of guy I'd like to have a beer with. I just really have something, I think it's simple or simplistic for me. When I worked in human resources and I did supervisor training, I used to tell supervisors not to criticize publicly and praise privately. So that's what I employ. I prefer to call people in rather than call them out. And I like to do it in private if the situation or the circumstances allow. Privately, I find I can be more effective by getting my point across and not lose a teachable moment by calling them out. Sometimes when you embarrass someone, or if the calling out makes them feel uncomfortable or awkward, you might just lose someone who is really trying. And on one hand, we say, don't be silent. But then when the teachable moment comes and you don't do it in a right way, you might lose that person altogether. So for me, it's really simple that I pull them to the side, have a follow-up conversation with them, and just really have that heart-to-heart, and understand, and making sure that they understand where I'm coming from, why this may or may not be the thing to say and how to say. And it doesn't work, again, like some of the questions earlier, it doesn't work for everyone, but it's something that can work for me. And I find it to be most effective.
Thanks, Ty, for sharing that. Sarah, how about you? What would you say in terms of calling people in rather than calling people out, and some strategies that you would recommend or that you've experienced?
Yes, so I think that that engaging in conversation with somebody who says something or does something in a moment, but I think also this, you know, the sense of, as certainly as a white person, the being in the position of being called out or being called in, or having, when someone takes the time to name something harmful that I've done, or to create or to correct a mistake that I've made, to see it as a gift, to see it as someone communicating to me that they have trust that I can change my behavior, and that I can change my behavior, and that they're willing to engage in that process with me. Not that then I expect that person to, I mean, Ty, you're talking about using these opportunities as, or using this as a teaching moment, which is something to be so grateful for, but also that it's not somebody that I've harmed or offended. It's not their responsibility to teach me or to give me that learning in the moment. Mm-hmm. And I think this piece about, you know, Winsome and Ty talking about having to communicate in ways to make white people feel safe. Part of being a white ally is to recognize that, and to find ways that people don't have to treat you gently, that you can sit with that discomfort, that you can take critique, you can make mistakes. So I would say thinking about how to learn how to make an apology that doesn't center yourself, and then educating yourself, and that thinking about how being an anti-racist ally means knowing that you're going to make mistakes and that you learn from those mistakes and keep going. So it's a little bit, I think we'll talk a little bit more about some strategies for calling folks in, but I know that sometimes it's about, well, how do you handle it when somebody names a harm that you do, or calls you in in the situation, and how can you handle that discomfort? And it can be scary and unpleasant.
Very.
Brandi, how about you?
So some strategies that I've used to help to call allies in or call people in has been through a few different methods. One, I would agree 100% with what Ty has shared, with having one-on-one conversations with individuals to help them understand diverse perspectives and experiences, because one important fact of the matter, I think, is that in America, we are not so far away from segregation and we're just literally a generation away from some of these civil liberties that minorities have not had access to. Although in 2020, we look at it like, well, we had a Black president, so racism doesn't exist, but it very much does. And so I think one strategy to build on what Ty said is to have those one-to-one conversations, and within both community organizations that I'm a part of, I've had the privilege to be able to do so, to be able to sit down one-to-one with the police chief and with the superintendent and be able to have conversations to gauge understanding. And I think one of the strategies that worked on both ends was to not only just have the conversation, but that those allies showed up ready to listen, to understand, listen to learn, listen to unlearn, and listen to support and figure out what those strategies of support would look like. And so that's one big important part. A second strategy also, when working within the university, diversity and inclusion, I worked with some colleagues to create a workshop called Responding to Racism in Clinical Settings. And so we were able to use real scenarios that have happened to students within our college, and then also build on that to use it within the parent group, and that allowed us to look at how to respond to racism in classroom settings. That opportunity allowed us a chance to raise the voices of oppressed people, to hear their stories, to put that in script form, and allow some actors from Ohio University's theater department to illustrate it visually, and allow folks from various backgrounds to sit, watch, and let it sit in, and also learn how to respond and how to stand up as allies and advocates. And so I believe that working with my colleagues, Mary Beekler and Dr. Sharon Casapola, we were able to look and strategize, calling out and calling in the fact that these things do exist, because within allyship, the feel-good things also are looking at the hard things. And so those are two strategies that I've been able to use within this work to help call in allies and call in our white friends.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing. I really appreciate how you said, when you're working with various audiences, to learn how to listen, and listen to learn, and listen to unlearn. I think that there's a lot to be said about that. And I think also, and it's sort of as a thread that I've heard from a number of you about, kind of calling them in and allowing them to understand maybe that not be the intent of what the person had said. They didn't intend to be offensive or to say something that made someone uncomfortable, or but to hear and to listen about the impact that statement had. So it was kind of disentangling the intent from, now that when you say that, this is how I feel. And I hope that between the two of us, or between you and future conversations, that you remember the impact, and less about, so again, and I think Sarah, you had mentioned about asking the questions and not centering yourself. So Sarah, I did want to come back to you and ask you a little bit of follow-up to something you had said about things that white people can do, and perhaps you've done or you've experienced in SURJ or other organizations, to deal with the discomfort and the unconscious bias.
Sure. So I think that as we've been talking about it, first of all, is acknowledging that anti-racist work is a journey. It's a long process. It's not something that you can go to a training and kind of check that off your box and think, okay, I'm an expert in this. I think also thinking that anti-racist work is both internal and external. So, there's so much work, so much good writing, so much good information that we need to be educating ourselves with. So learning about the history of race in the US, learning what movements have been happening already, what history are we not taught in school, what do we not know, and taking the time to really educate ourselves, but also knowing that that's not enough, that at the same time, we have to find ways to take action. And so when we're sitting with that discomfort, so going into spaces where we're going to listen and hear what we're being asked to do, are we being asked to, are we being asked to speak up in a meeting that a person of color has already made a request in a meeting or in an organization and that hasn't been listened to? And so now it's trying to shift that power dynamic. But I think also the sitting with the discomfort and trying to find ways to manage that is maybe first think about your sphere of influence. So what feels reasonable for you to take on in terms of who are people you can have ongoing conversations with about changes? What policies can you influence? What organizations are you part of? But also, we talk in SURJ a lot about what are our core values? So I think just finding people, whether it's other people who are working as allies in different settings, finding people you can have conversations with about what are your core values and how does being anti-racist fit into that? What's your stake in racial justice work? And that, I think, helps emphasize why it's important to be uncomfortable, why it's important to push your comfort level and to do new things or learn things that are really devastating, to know all this information about the history of the US that we aren't necessarily taught in school. How are you gonna cope with that? How are you gonna deal with that without sort of putting the labor back on the people of color in your lives? So those are some of the pieces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. Winsome, how about you? What would you say?
Thanks, Connie. So as I was preparing for today's presentation, there is a blog and a website on Allyship, and you can go on and add to it sort of in a Wikipedia way. And one of the things I found there that I really like, it's called Boots and Sandals: How to Handle Mistakes, and it was contributed by Presley Pizzle, right? And so here's the way she talks about it. She says, think of your privilege as a boot, like a big, heavy boot, and that you're stepping on someone's feet. The feet that you're stepping on, they're wearing sandals. And so think of your privilege as the big boot. Think of oppressed people as wearing sandals. If someone says, ouch, you're stepping on my toes, how do you react? So kind of walk with me here through this, and keep in mind, I'm an educator. And as Erica Badu said, keep in mind, I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about my SHIT. So I am a graduate of the Patton College. I'm an educator first. So here we go. So you're wearing this big heavy boot and somebody else is wearing a sandal. You step on their feet, their toes, and they say, ouch. So what's your response? Is your response going to be, I can't believe you think I'm a toe stepper? I'm a good person. Or is it going to be what she refers to as denial of others' experiences that are different from yours? I don't mind when people step on my toes. Or derailing, which is, some people don't even have toes. Why aren't we talking about them instead? Our refusal to center the impacted. All toes matter. Or you're going to tone police them. I'd move my foot if you'd ask me more nicely. Or you're going to deny that the problem is fixable. Toes getting stepped on is a fact of life. You'll be better off when you accept that. Or are you going to blame them? You shouldn't have been walking around in sandals anyway. Or you're going to withdraw, which is, I thought you wanted my help, but I guess not. I'll just go home. Instead, because this is when we look at what we're talking about with how we center ourselves and how we tend to become defensive when we are called in or called out, is exactly what we tend to see happen with this boot and sandal scenario. So instead, why don't you center the impacted? Oh, my toes are hurting. Oh, are you okay? Listen to their response and learn. Apologize for the impact, even though you didn't intend it. Because again, remember, we say intent is different from impact by just saying, I'm sorry. Stop the instance. Just go ahead and move your foot. Or stop the pattern. Be careful where you step in the future when it comes to oppression. And if needs be, change your footwear. Thank you, Connie.
Winsome, that's excellent. I've heard similar versions of that, but I have not heard the boot and sandal analogy. So I really appreciate that. I think it really brings home all the responses that we've heard and the all toes matter. Sort of appreciate the little bit of levity in the conversation, but I think it's you know, it's just spot on. So I really appreciate that analogy and you walking us through the various responses. We do have a question in the chat about the calling in and calling out. And so Brandi, I'd like to ask you if you wouldn't mind sharing, especially through your hat of the Athens Parents for Racial Equality, some strategies that can be used in the classrooms. And I know your experience might be more in the K-12 classroom, but I think a lot of these lessons can be transferable to higher education classrooms as well.
And so I would like to share first that professionally, I have worked P through 16 and also with graduate schools. So you're right, these strategies I've used professionally in pre-K classrooms through high school, but also with graduate students and college students at Ohio University. And so one of the strategies, I actually wanted to kind of start off with an example of a situation that did happen with my daughter in the classroom and kind of what sort of catapulted this conversation with other teachers and principals and a superintendent on things that can be done. When we first moved back into Athens, I came here as a student in the early 2000s and then came back as a professional later on. And so my daughter started elementary school here, and one of the difficulties that she was having was classroom engagement, feeling as if maybe the teachers were not including her, and then also the students not including her, with specifically being told that their parents did not want them to have Black friends. So coming home, that was a difficulty for her. And as a parent, that's difficult because working at a university and then coming home and wondering if you made the right decision to move into a town with people who may not look like you, where you are the minority and then your child is a minority and they're questioning their identity. The first strategy that I did use was to go into the school and to have a conversation with the teacher and the principal, specifically around the messages that were coming from students in her classroom, and also to ask in more of a call-in type of way strategies were they using to help engage students of color in the classroom? Their response wasn't the response I was hoping for. It was just a response of, well, that's the way people around here feel. And, you know, pretty much a response in terms of, you know, that's the way people feel, that there's nothing that we can really do about it. Some of the strategies that I used in response was to look at, you know, are there books in the classroom that you have that speaks to inclusive classroom spaces? Are there ways that you can invite my daughter into the carpet circle, morning meetings in the morning, and really elevate her voice and give her a space in the classroom to feel welcome and included? Are there ways that you can introduce books with people from different cultural backgrounds so that the classroom can begin to understand that diversity is a positive thing? You might not look the same, but we all have unique talents and gifts to bring to the table. And so although at that moment, maybe it wasn't completely heard or received, at this point, some years down the line, it has created a larger dialogue on how we could create more inclusive communities. And so I think teachers definitely have been a part of this parent group. Community members is people from all different backgrounds and walks of life who have come together, and we've strategized to look at how we can engage in the conversation of inclusion and diversity in the classroom through history, through social studies. What kind of book clubs can we start? What kind of conversations or people can we bring into the school who are from diverse backgrounds, so that students could get familiar with looking at people from diverse backgrounds and knowing that there are positive images out there, as opposed to maybe the images or stereotypes that they've been presented through media or through what their parents and families have taught them. And so those same strategies we've also used in higher ed classrooms in terms of looking at hiring practices and faculty who's in front of students teaching, knowing that just because you're a minority doesn't mean you're limited to talking about D&I. There are great experts in STEM and in math and in English and literature. And so we have developed a list of resources, of books to present before our kids. We've done movie series and invited community members and parents to come and sit and have discussions, as well as social opportunities to engage, because I'm from Cleveland, Ohio is very segregated. In Athens also is very, very white. And so when you come into a place and you've never seen a person of color before, and you've never had that interaction, it's easy to have fears. But with the parent group, we try to create social spaces so that we can promote inclusivity and give people an opportunity to get to connect with each other based off of values, based off of just experiences, and have a great time building those relationships. So those are some strategies that we've used within the parent group and also within the university setting as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think, you know, one of the takeaways of this on the flyer were strategies, things that people can really put into practice, and you know, today and tomorrow, and again every day, as the title of the presentation today is. So thank you. You know, we were talking earlier and thinking about you know, strategies. So how, my next question is, you know, how can we open white people's eyes to systemic racism or inequalities? I think earlier the boot and the sandal analogy is something that really resonated, but that's still just one person to one person. And we know, and even in the introductory video, various levels of racism, and really seeking to be anti-racist as it relates to the systems and the structural racism. So I'd like to ask Sarah, so how can we open white people's eyes to the systemic racism?
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I think that, you know, that part of it is just having these conversations more frequently. So a lot of what Brandi's talking about in terms of having conversations with our kids, but normalizing having these conversations about power dynamics and how that's reflected in history. So there's an educational piece of thinking, giving people tools to think about the power dynamics between different populations in the country, and why do we talk about white supremacist culture. What does that mean? But also just this historical knowledge about how white supremacy keeps us divided, that it's part of. So for me, my personal journey in anti-racist work started as growing up in rural Appalachia in a poor family, and really having a hard time coming to terms with why wasn't the oppression of poor white Appalachians parallel or equal to the oppression of people of color in the US, and really having to wrestle with, well, what does white privilege mean? What does that mean for people who live in poor, disadvantaged communities? And understanding that there's this history in our country that plays into that I can still, it's much easier for me to go into a space as a white person, regardless of my economic background, and negotiate that space and have some control over how I present myself, how I present my identity. But that those are components, that they're reasons that we don't talk about shared experiences. But I think that what I would say in terms of strategies is encouraging people to have more conversations, encouraging people, providing easy ways for people to be educated about history, but also, this piece about if you're as a white person, if you're interested in anti-racist work, that's the first step. And I think finding ways to have those conversations with other white people. So learning about maybe the local community, but also building strategies for being uncomfortable and making mistakes and getting engaged in community activities.
Thanks. I appreciate those. I appreciate the examples and your feedback. Ty, I wanted to elaborate a little bit in a segue, continuing on to what Sarah was saying, with the question being, creating environments for these conversations and opening people's eyes, and ask you a little bit to elaborate on what you think white people can do or should do to create or establish a safe environment for people of color or other non-white people.
Well, I think it's an excellent way to piggyback off what my friend and colleague Sarah just said, and also to acknowledge what the College of Education is doing. My college, by the way. I'm almost at a loss for words, because instead of waiting on a particular office like diversity and inclusion or someone else, we have all these experts at Ohio University on an academic environment, but we don't talk about these things. And perhaps inviting some people who don't feel comfortable or don't feel safe, I know it's somewhat contradicting, because if they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel safe, but where else can you have this conversation than in a situation like this? Mm-hmm. There's training that's available, and as Winsome noted earlier, she offers the training. Folks need to take advantage of things like this. I don't think we need to make things mandatory, but it could just be so much more helpful if we are in a space where we can have safe dialogue about the things that impact us, because we're not here by ourselves. We're not just, I know we like to say like we're in silos, but for higher education, you can't be in a silo, because when you're walking down the street, when you walk into the classroom and the faculty member walk in, and he may have a class of 200 people, but there's only 2 people in the classroom who look like me or people of color, we need to learn, we need to train, we need to speak up and say, hey, I don't know how to do this. so that there can be forums such as this to make this kind of thing happen. I don't know. If we're not learning it here, then where are we learning it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Ty. And I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate that it sort of brings me back to the quote that you hear. It's like, well, if not us, then who? Mm-hmm. And if not when, or excuse me, if not, when now, right? So it's we need to have these conversations, and I'm proud to be in the Patton College at Ohio University, where, again, talking about prioritizing diversity and celebrating diversity and learning from each other, because while we may or may not work in silos, we live in the community and we wear multiple hats that that impact who we are and how we present in the academy, in the community, with our children, at schools. So there's so many facets to that. So I appreciate your comment. Amen. So I think going with that then, and really kind of like, okay, so we're going to have these forums, we're going to, listen in. I did want to get to some real concrete examples about allies. And so, and Winsome, I'm going to come to you first, but so what are ways, and as tangible as possible that you can be an ally, whether it's in higher education at a university or maybe as a parent or even among your friends, because again, we do wear multiple hats. So could you speak to that a little bit in terms of what ways people can maybe change and become more active allies?
Sure, absolutely. So if we go, I want to quickly go back to that question about helping white people understand. One of the articles that came out this summer is Catherine Poe, P-U-G-H, and she is an attorney. And it is about really challenging white people to think about their role in all of this. And she makes it very clear that there's a trigger warning at the beginning of her article, right? Because she's saying white people are going to be pissed off. So I'm going to let you know right now, if you're comfortable, read this. If not, don't. And the fact is, and I want us to think about this because like Connie was saying, I'm also a graduate of the Patton College of Education, and I went through the Cultural Studies program, the Critical Studies program, which is about looking at our society, looking at our power works, and questioning those structures. And so let's think about this for a minute. African Americans, Black people in this country are what, 13% of the population, right? Why is it that we are always having to educate the majority of the people in this country about these issues when these are issues that they created? This is what she's asking. And I would like everyone who's listening today to sit with that for a minute and also share that with your family members. But what are some ways that we can be allies, right? Okay, so there are several ways. One of them is to be a sponsor. When you're a sponsor, what do you do? What's the role of the sponsor? The role of the sponsor is to be vocally supportive of the work of colleagues from underrepresented groups. For example, talk about the expertise you see in others during a performance, for example. Recommend people for assignments. Here's another one. It's called the champion. What's the role of the champion? You act similarly to the sponsor, but does so in more public venues. The champion, you do the same thing the sponsor is doing, but you're doing it in more public venues. For example, if there is a question, divert that question to the person who's there from a group. It doesn't matter the group, who or the expert in that area, so that everyone in that space recognizes that you see this person as an expert, because people of color often get sidelined. Be the amplifier. What are you as the amplifier? You take the role as an ally who works to ensure that marginalized voices are heard and respect. What do you do as an amplifier? You create a code of conduct. Think about your meetings. Think about your staff meetings, your student meetings, right? You create a code of conduct where you shared any information that's communicated, including email, etc., to everyone. Also, when an idea is suggested, and we see this also, and I know we're focusing on race today, but we also tend to see that when it comes to women that are in spaces that are male-dominated spaces, where if someone makes a suggestion, say good idea, repeat that idea as the amplifier, and give them credit. I'm going to stop there because I know that some of our panelists may have some other ideas they want to share, and if not, I'll come back around.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so in speaking about allies too, Brandi, could you speak to allyship in terms of inclusive classrooms?
Sure. So there is a framework called Inclusive Excellence, and it's a motto that definitely you can find online. Universities are using it, but I also feel like it's something that can be incorporated into P through 12 classrooms, and it's looking at it as, you know, the responsibility for diversity, equity, and inclusion just isn't on the person of color. It's just not on the diversity advocate or ally who's that one person at the school, but it's a shared responsibility for teachers, faculty, staff, administrators, and so looking at building that structure of inclusion from the recruitment process, the onboarding process, all the way through how you build your curriculum, how you engage in social groups and organizations and sports, that inclusion, diversity and inclusion is a thread throughout every aspect of education. And so I think as people start to incorporate it and look at diversity and inclusion and creating an inclusive excellence model, and really start to reshape the way education was designed. Because if we really think historically about the way education was designed, it was designed excluding people of color. We were not allowed to read. We weren't allowed to be to go to school. We weren't allowed to do a lot of those things. So when looking at systemic racism, those things were built generations before we were even here at the table currently. So we have to kind of go backward and work and look at each entry of our pathway into education, as well as into institutions of higher education, and that inclusive excellence framework, which you'll definitely find online through AACOM or through the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They have colleges and universities who are using this model, but I think it would be really important for primary, secondary educators to look at that, incorporating that model into your elementary school spaces. In addition, with doing that, looking at the curriculum and doing that inclusively with your parents, doing it inclusively with community members who might have stake in understanding some different histories, and you can include it as an elective. It doesn't have to always be something that maybe there are state and federal regulations of what you have to do, but you can include it in other social spaces, making sure that our students have access and awareness to understanding diverse perspectives. And so that is one or two examples of how to build and create inclusive classrooms.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a question from the chat that I'd like to get to, and I'm cognizant of our time here, but this has been a really great conversation. So Sarah, I'm actually going to come to you first on this question. But so what recourse is there when dealing with people who still just don't get it after the issue of bias or microaggressions has been addressed?
So I think that it's going to depend on the context. Certainly if this is depending on the relationship with the person, but I think in a university setting or in an organizational context, this is an important thing to think through before the situation arises. So an organization should have policies and, you know, the code of conduct that folks were discussing, so that there's an understanding of what's expected in an organizational setting. And if somebody can't adhere to those expectations, that there would be consequences, in the same way that if somebody can't do their job, but to communicate in a way that how is this part of somebody's job.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's we put our money where our mouth is, and we promote and provide reinforcement for behaviors we want to see. So if things are persistently, you know, if people are persistently not getting it, then yeah, we need to have those clear, you know, those clear consequences. So I'd like to start wrapping things up and ask you to speak to some of the takeaways or action steps you'd like the audience to have from this forum. I'm asking maybe just one or two, and then we'll start working on closing them up. But what, if you could have someone take away anything from this forum, what would be one or two of those things? And I'm going to start with Ty.
Okay, thank you for that question also. And here's where I want to say, although white people and people of color have different experiences, everyone suffers when they remain silent about this type of work. So, as Martin Luther King said, we will have to repent, in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people.
Mm-hmm.
So, in saying that, I think about allyship in two different terms: performative or visual, and supportive. But overall, voice, practice, and action. So performative allyship makes a statement, but doesn't go beneath the surface, focusing on the helping rather than standing in solidarity. Involves no real risk. It is one that is performed from the safety of one's comfort zone and privilege. Whereas supportive allyship, you check on a colleague, friends, across identity differences, just as Winsome said earlier. Keep supporting after the outrage. Keep supporting after George Floyd, not just when George Floyd happened. Support businesses and causes that align themselves with inclusive values. Listen more, speak less. I know you said one or two, and it's all included in there, but I just have to say this last part. I was listening to an interview by Resmaa Menakem, the therapist and trauma specialist, and in his interview with Krista Tippett recently, he said, "Nothing can move a mountain like a white woman's tears."
Oh, yeah.
And let me just tell you what that quote means to me. It speaks to me of the power of hierarchy that is even present in American society, and how critical the actions of our white brothers and sisters are to this movement. So that's my takeaway. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this important discussion.
Thank you so much, Ty. Brandi, what would you want an audience to come away from after hearing this conversation? A few things. It's okay, Ty. You did more than two. That's fine.
Thank you.
Brandi.
I think that it's important for allies to remember and to know that you are so important. You're an important part of this movement for change. You help to create that barometer for change in partnership and in collaboration with minoritized people, not for saviorism, not for performative shows, to really create change systemically, individually, interpersonally within our communities. And I think one of the biggest, simplest takeaways that I would say is to continue to do a triple eye check. The allyship is important and it's introspective. That triple eye check includes looking and measuring your integrity. Check in with your value system, whatever that value is. If it's your beliefs, you believe in God, spirituality, a higher power, whatever your values are at the core of who you are, and making sure that aligns with the cause of allyship and anti-racism. And if that integrity check, if there's some confusion there or some discrepancy, you have a chance internally to kind of sit back and reflect on that and figure out how you could align effectively and in a way that's going to create cohesion and not confusion. And then that second eye in the triple eye check is to look at your intentions, making sure that your intentions are pure, that it's authentic, and that it's actually to create and promote social change when promoting anti-racism. And then the last thing is looking at the impact that you want to make and making sure that that impact is going to be something that's moving the anti-racism agenda forward and not setting it back. And so I think that the biggest takeaway is that to continue to do your triple eye check in allyship and making sure that we're able to continue moving forward in a way that is productive and is going to create social change.
Thank you. I appreciate the triple eye check, and that's something that I think people can do every day, and not necessarily only when the conversation has to do with race, but thinking about that as it relates to a lot of the ways we interact with other people. Winsome, how about you? What would you say some of the takeaways you'd like to have from this forum would be?
Sure. Thanks, Connie. So once again, I would like to thank the Penn College of Education for inviting me to be a part of this really important conversation at this time in our country, as well as to the audience for joining us and for being here. And I'm hoping that you have learned something and that you will take this with you and share with the colleagues in your areas that are not on this call today. So I know, Connie, you said 2, but I have 4. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So, okay. Yeah, we have 8 minutes. So, I want to say to the audience, for those of you who are really interested in being allies, is to make sure you take this struggle on your own, as your own, and understand that you're going to mess up and that it is okay. The important thing is that the people that you're working for see and know that you mean well and that you are trying. That is what is important. Fear of messing up is often what keeps people from getting involved. There's also this notion that somebody else is going to do it, so I don't have to. That is not good enough in my book. The other takeaways is, some other takeaways I have. Ty mentioned white women's tears, and I want to mention that there is a body of literature, including books and peer review articles out there on white women's tears. And what that means is, and to summarize all of those is, whenever there's an uncomfortable conversation, what tends to happen is that white women tends to start crying. Then what happens in the room is the attention is now focused on this person who's crying, and everybody is now pissed off at the presenter for making this woman cry, without focusing on what the presenter was actually talking about. So White Women's Tears is actually rooted in decentering conversations from people of color. So look that up as well. The other piece I want to talk about is there are two other things, is white men. So if you're a white male in this forum, and for white male, I'm specifically focused on white, straight Christian males, is there was research coming out of Harvard, I think 2 or 3 years ago, where they looked at evaluations in 300 companies and found that white men, let me say this again, white men is the only group that was never penalized for talking about diversity at work. As a matter of fact, some of them were promoted and even given extra money. And so you can be a really, 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 really great ally in this area. And also you can look up that research. And I'm gonna close with saying, for those of you who joined us right at the beginning, you heard the dean's video, and the dean spoke about being hopeful. And I am not as hopeful as the dean, so I would like to put that out there. So last November, I went to a conference. There's a group that oversees Black cultural centers all around the country at universities. And our conference was held last year at OSU. And an associate professor at OSU addressed us. And I'm completely blanking on his name, but I wanted to say that to make sure I am not taking credit for his work. Again, going back, what we talked about being ally is make sure you are centering people of color who have done this work. And we asked, like, how are you feeling about where we're going and our work? And he says, I am hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. He says, I am hopeful because hope is rooted in faith, and I am a person of faith. I am also a person of faith, so I am hopeful, just as our dean is. However, he says, I am not optimistic, because optimism is rooted in facts. And if we go back to the facts and the history in the founding of this country, I have no reason to be optimistic as a Black immigrant woman, but I'm hopeful because it's rooted in faith. Thank you, Connie.
Those are very important. Sarah, I'd like to come to you last.
Sure, thanks. And I think I'll just end by the piece reinforcing things that I've said, things that other folks have said. What is your stake in a vision of a racially just world? What is your interest in making that happen? But then also to think about, a lot of this information is overwhelming, but to think about your sphere of influence and where you can start in taking small actions and also larger actions, thinking about the workplace, thinking about your family, thinking about schools, parenting, other organizations that you're part of, thinking about where are places that you are in a position of power to start these conversations if they haven't been started already, or to lift them up and to emphasize the significance of this beyond the historic moment that we're in, and knowing that the work it's going to be a lot of work into the future. It has been. Thank you.
Thank you. Ty, you had one last thing you wanted to say.
I know, I can't believe I missed it because I wrote it down. Vote. Please vote. It's not just good enough that you're registered to vote. Vote.
I'll take you one soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have come to the conclusion of our forum. I want to sincerely thank each of our panelists for today's event and for sharing their time and experiences with us. And I want to thank you for joining us today. The evaluation for today's event is being placed in the chat, and we encourage you to take a few minutes and give us feedback about your experience. And as I mentioned earlier, a recording of this session will be added to the Patton College YouTube channel by the end of the week. And then the next forum in the Patton College of Education Black Lives Matter series will be held on October 12th from 12 to 1:30, and the theme will be Brothers Rise, recruiting African American males into the teaching profession through hip hop education. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you have a great day. Woo!